of Europe died. But Europe was not alone. Africa, the Middle East, India, and East Asia were all in its path of destruction. In the end, it was suspected that worldwide, 200 million people died. A number so high that every outbreak before or since has not even come close. And this is especially impressive when you figure in that the world population at the time was approximately 500 million. Our story begins not in Europe, but far in the East. No one is exactly certain where the plague hides its lair, but many agree it lies somewhere where the Great Eurasian steppe meets the Gobi Desert. Some claim it came from the Mongolian plateau, from the region of the Great Desert itself, a place that Marco Polo on his journey would say that when a traveler became isolated, he would hear the voices of devils leading him astray, and the arid wind could make 1,000 fantasies throng to the mind. Whereas others felt it was on the banks of Lake Issyk-Kul, one of the deepest lakes in the world, where the contagion lay in wait. Now left to its own devices, the plague would infect small rodents and animals, and due to its lethal nature, it would not have easily been able to escape its isolated domain. But by the mid-14th century, the steppe was unified by the Pax Mongolica, and trade had rebounded on a massive scale. What was once a desolate and isolated land was now crisscrossed by the Silk Roads. It was traversed by throngs of merchants hoping to make their fortune. A multitude of trade stations and oasis stopping points were also established. What's more, to expedite
messages that kept the bureaucracy of the Great Mongol Empire.
Yes, we would like to begin. I would like to officially welcome our Dean to begin with his. Apologies for that. I would like to welcome our Dean to begin his welcoming remarks. Thank you.
Our chief guest and keynote speaker, His Excellency Most Reverend Archbishop Hubertus van Megen, the Apostolic Nuncio to Kenya and South Sudan. The DVC Administration and Finance, and also the one standing in for the VC designate, Reverend Dr. Leo Simon Mwenda, members of faculty from different schools and institutes of Tangaza University College, and also from other theological institutions in Kenya, our esteemed speakers of the day, our theology students from Tangaza University College and from other theological institutions in Kenya, all of you present here, and all those who are joining us virtually from Kenya and other parts of the world. Greetings and peace. It is my joy and privilege to warmly welcome each and every one of you to this year's Theological Symposium, which has been organized by the Church History Program in the Institute of Theology of Tangaza University College with the theme, The Church and the State in the Post-Pandemic Era. Lessons from History, 900 years from the First Lateran Council, 700 years from the beginning of the Black Death pandemic. The symposium will endeavor to address from different perspectives the notions of the conflict between the church and the state as well as the ecclesiastical response to pandemics and the post-pandemic situation in the light of the COVID-19 pandemic. We are privileged to have present, physically as well as virtually, very competent and qualified speakers who will enlighten and enrich us today and tomorrow with their presentations on the theme of the symposium. I would like to extend my deepest appreciation to those who have been involved in organizing this event, that is the Church History Program, led by its coordinator, Dr. Radek Malinowski, the Secretary to the Symposium, Mr. Aloysius Minor, and all the members of the Symposium Steering Committee. What we see before us today, as well as what we shall see tomorrow, is a testament of their hard work. Let us give them a round of applause. I thank you all for taking your time to be part of this important event. I sincerely hope that everyone today will find this Church History Symposium an enjoyable and rewarding experience. Thank you, and please enjoy the symposium.
Father Josaphat, thank you for your kind words. I'm a little bit afraid because you already gave us a clap and we barely started, so now we really have to perform. And well, you give us a task. But I just want to make a few remarks about the symposium from the organizer point of view. It was mentioned that this year the symposium is hosted by the Church History Program, a program that I am leading, and it is a small, but I believe very vibrant cell of our university. And I would like to introduce the members of this program to you. So we have our team sitting here, Father Paul Chiare, Father Mwaniki, and Father Ngulu. We are here together with you, and we will have this symposium together with you. And of course, we cannot forget our special coordinator, Mr. Okay, sorry for that. There was a small technical glitch. We welcome also Mr. Majna, who is also our graduate, and he recently completed his studies in the Catholic University of Lublin, where he is specializing in the church history. It is through his hard work that this is possible. This symposium is focusing on a very special moment in the life of the church, but also believe in the life of the society and the state. We are talking about bubonic plague that ravaged the world in 14th century. And this plague had also a name of Black Death, simply because people who were affected by this plague were getting black patches on the bodies. And because of those black patches, they were actually nicknamed victims of the Black Death. This special moment affected European society, Asian society, and above all, African society. And it is our intention, as well as the intention of our program, to bring the African story into the history of Universal Church. We all know the story of Christianity in Africa starts with the beginning of our faith. When you are in Egypt, the Christians will remind you that we are the only place next to Palestine when we had Jesus Christ walking on our soil. But the glorious African church, the church of St. Augustine, St. Cyril of Alexandria, St. Cyprian, continues its journey, and is also our intention to remind you that the Church of Africa does not stop interaction with the universal church in antiquity. It continues throughout the Middle Ages. And that continuation, that experience also is affected by the issue we are going to talk about, bubonic plague and the conflict between the church and the state. Our symposium, our conference is organized in a special way. Besides having presentations in the hall, we are also organizing an exhibition. It is, as you exit the hall, on your left. So if you are interested in the topic of the symposium, you can slowly and peacefully go through the exhibition and get the basic facts about what we are going to talk. For those students who are more interested, we organize a special game, a game that is going to give them interesting rewards, the game about the knowledge of the society in Middle Ages. As you enter our university, you see 4 pictures. Those are the 4 medieval centers of the world in 14th century. You have Rome, you have Constantinople, you have Paris, and you have Cairo. Our symposium is also trying to bring the aspect of internationalization. We are trying to keep the speed of the changes that are happening around the world, and the world of academia in Europe, in US, in Asia, in Africa is focusing on collaboration, on partnership, and on bringing scholars and students from different academic centers to collaborate and work together. And this symposium also is trying to take part in that process. We have guests from Italy, from Poland, from United States, and also online from Brazil and from Spain. We also have our other events that we will mention later. But as for now, from the position of the Church History Program Coordinator, I would like to thank you very much for attending this symposium. A special thanks is to our keynote speaker. I had a brief chat with Your Excellency before coming here, and we all agreed how important church history is in the studies of Christianity, and we all agreed how important studying map is. As we know, maps are important. And in Tangaza, we know very well maps are very important to study. And I'm very happy to hear that our keynote speaker is also sharing the same experience. So thank you very much for availing yourself. And I would like to welcome Father Leo, who is going to make the remarks and welcome our keynote speaker.
So, Your Excellency, Most Reverend Hubertus Van Meegen, the Apostolic Nuncio to Kenya and South Sudan, our invited scholars from different parts of the world, our DVC, academics and student life, our deans and directors, faculty and staff, our students, our protocols observed, good morning. I stand before you to represent our Vice Chancellor, Reverend Professor Apolonia Chishugi, so as to welcome all of you to Tangaza University College. This academic exercise, organized and spearheaded by the Department of Church History in the School of Theology, is valuable in the sense of production of knowledge, intellectual development, and academic stimulation of our students. This conference is particularly exciting because it brings historical experiences of the Church to bear on our present post-pandemic situation in the Church and in the world. If you want to know how relevant the questions being asked by these conferences today, you may visit the social media communications of different peoples around the world in the early 2020. At this time, the coronavirus pandemic was at its peak and immense panic rented the air. Many governments, including the government of Kenya, banned public worship without consulting religious leaders. Churches and parish gates were ordered closed, even for the individual faithful who would have wished to access sacraments. This measure struck at the heart of the Catholic liturgical life, and the prominent question as to whether the government had overstepped its mandate obviously came up. But as we know, or as the Symposium will tell us today, the Catholic Church has seen precedents in disagreeing with the leaders of the polity, as well as situations of pandemics. Shall we forget the estrangement between Pope Gregory VII and King Henry IV of Germany over the practice of lay investiture in medieval Europe? Or shall we fail to notice some similarities of responses between the coronavirus pandemic in our time and the bubonic plague outbreak in medieval Europe, Asia, and parts of Africa? History teaches us that the gospel of Jesus Christ has always had to contend for space in a convoluted and dramatic arena of this world, be it socio-political turmoil, economic chaos, religious confusion, natural catastrophes, and so on. The Christian believer always had to ask some questions. What is it that God is doing here? What is it that Jesus Christ is telling us in this situation? What is our proper response as Christians to what God is doing? As a church, how do we accompany our fellow human beings in view of what Jesus is telling us at this point in our history? My hope is that the reflections emerging out of this conference will serve to give scope and direction in some of the questions we are asking as a local and universal church. I particularly want to encourage our students in the School of Theology to stay put, to listen, and to think about the reflections shared in this symposium. Since many of you are training for the evangelizing ministry of the church, it is in occasions such as this where you learn to theologize and to do pastoral discernment for the good of the church and the world. Without further ado then, may I once more say that we are honored to welcome and to host all of you for this symposium as the university administration. And now, I humbly take this opportunity to welcome His Excellency Monsignor Hubertus van Megen to give us his keynote address. Welcome, Your Excellency.
Santa Sana. Thank you very much. Of course, pleasure to be here this morning. Deputy Vice Chancellors, the Dean, Father Josaphat, Professor Malinowski, the directors, men and women, students and invited guests, all protocol observed. Actually, coming into the house, I immediately recognized these pictures from my old homestead, so to say, in Khartoum, where I lived nearly 10 years of my life. Images out of the desert, images from churches of the then Christian Nubian kingdom of Dongola, and you can still visit those places, by the way, in the desert, along the Nile, up there to the north of Khartoum, all the way up to the Egyptian border. Beautiful places to visit, and some of these images, as you see them here, the one of Anna, I prefer very much. You also can find in the National Museum in Khartoum. And then also here the image of Christ the Pantocrator from the Hagia Sophia. We have our Turkish friends here in our midst. Witness of Christian faith and of coexistence between Christianity and Islam. So feel very much at home today. And also these images, I think they are from Chartres, the glass-stained windows, witnesses of church history of our forefathers. I come today here to give a keynote myself among them. I'm just struggling along a bit in church history, so don't be too critical with me if here and there I miss the mark. Because Tangaza University College thought it was wise and interesting to invite the Apostolic Nuncio, so I am not to blame if I stand here today to speak to you on this occasion where we put our heads together and reflect on the events of the First Lateran Council of 1123 and then the Black Death. The Black Death, as far as we know, myself being a European, arrived in Europe in 1347. A fleet of ships had arrived in the port of Messina in Sicily in southern Italy. And when they had put anchor, it was discovered that many of the sailors were gravely ill. They even hadn't managed to throw the dead bodies overboard. And the sick were covered with black boils that oozed blood and pus. And people were horrified at the sight, but nobody knew that this scene would repeat itself 1,000 times, 1,000,000 times, and would be amplified all over Europe. Over the next 5 years, more than 20 million people died before the disease subsided. And people didn't know what to do, didn't understand the origins, didn't understand how to treat it. And the only thing one could do was to put the infected persons as soon as possible into quarantine. Did you know, by the way, that the word quarantine comes from the 40 days that a person needed to isolate himself from the word 40 in French. And the port city of Ragusa, also in Sicily, did exactly that. Sailors coming into the port had to isolate themselves for 40 days on their ships before they were allowed onto land, thus slowing the disease. Meanwhile, in panic, healthy people did all they could to avoid the sick. Doctors refused their patients, priests refused to administer last rites, and shopkeepers closed their stores. Many people fled the cities for the countryside, but even there was no escape for the disease. In fact, it even affected cows and sheep and goats and pigs and chickens as well as people. In fact, so many sheep died during the Black Plague that the whole European wool industry collapsed. And many people, desperate to save themselves, abandoned their sick and their dying loved ones. Thus doing, an Italian author wrote, each thought to secure immunity for himself. But they didn't understand the biology behind the disease. Many believed that the Black Death was like a kind of divine punishment, retribution for sins against God, such as greed and blasphemy and heresy and fornication and worldlessness. And by this logic, the only way to overcome the plague was to win God's forgiveness. And some people believed that the way to do so was to purge their communities of heretics and other troublemakers. So, for example, many thousands of Jews were massacred between 1348 and 1349, and thousands more fled to the sparsely populated regions of Eastern Europe, nowadays Poland, for example, and then Russia, where they could be relatively safe from the rampaging mobs in the city. On the 6th of July 1348, Pope Clement VI issued the first of two bulls instructing Christians not to blame the Jews for the plague epidemic then sweeping across Europe, noting that Jews too were dying from the Black Death. Clement announced that people who cast blame on the Jews had been seduced by the liar, the devil. By the way, do you remember how during the COVID epidemic we would accuse the Chinese? Pope Clement VI, born as Pierre Roger in Aquitaine, France in 1291, had been elected Pope about 6 years before the plague's outbreak in 1342. He was a trained monk, the fourth of 7 Avignon popes, undertaking autopsies on victims' bodies in the hope of finding a telltale sign, and he asked his papal astronomers to look to the sky for answer in the stars. But people were also dying in Avignon, the city of the popes. They were dying so quickly that the cemeteries ran out of space, and survivors began dumping bodies in the Rhone River. Clement ordered additional burial grounds to be prepared, but he also declared burial in the water to be acceptable. He also announced that those who died without having been given their last rites as Christians would still be able to enter into heaven. The Church lost nearly 40% of its priests to the Black Death. By the way, many of you who are religious know that many of the religious congregations, especially in Europe, lost many of their elderly members as well. The English clergy died at an alarming rate, including 3 bishops of Canterbury in the span of 1 year. Monasteries suffered immensely as the plague wiped out entire religious communities, and the high percentage of clergy death because of the plague produced a shortage of priests, which the Church tried to ameliorate by lowering the minimum age of ordination from 25 to 20 years. Imagine, you could have lived at that time, you would have been a priest already. Although, understandably given the circumstances, this action produced a cadre of inexperienced, young, and poorly formed priests. The quality of the priesthood suffered, and with it the Church as a whole, as ecclesiastical abuses became widespread in the 15th century, leading, many believe, to the Protestant Revolution in the 16th century. Prior to the Black Death, across most of Europe, land was scarce and lords controlled an abundant agricultural labor force subjected to serfdom, an exploitative form of labor coercion that sharply restricted freedom of employment and movement. Yet, in areas with a high death sentence, many such peasants ended up fleeing their manors in the hope of finding better working conditions and pay elsewhere. These dynamics fundamentally changed socioeconomic conditions in the areas that suffered from the highest death toll. In those areas, the system of serfdom was replaced by an emerging free labor market. And given the lords' weakened capacity to directly administer their lands, many peasants began to land collectively and to self-govern without direct oversight by the nobility. Many former serfs also fled to the cities, which led to a pattern of increased urbanization. In general, the bargaining power of laborers increased massively, while the power of those who possessed land notably declined. In numerous cities and towns, the newly gained strength by the lower socioeconomic groups also led to the institutionalization of, imagine, electoral participation. The adoption of these early forms of democracy in combination with the ability of peasants to self-govern radically altered power structures in a medieval society. Yet in areas that were only lightly hit by the Black Death, such dynamics did not unfold because labor had not become scarce. Thus, in those serfdom persisted, making the adoption of proto-democratic institutions unlikely. Let us then focus on the lands of the German-speaking Central Europe, where I also come from, or the Holy Roman Empire. The Holy Roman Empire was a large but weak confederation consisting of hundreds of different local political units. Major military conflicts, such as the 30 Years' War in the 17th century, solidified the empire's decentralized organization and prevented the emergence of a centralized nation-state, which in turn gave ample space for local political traditions to persist over time. Because of this decentralization, which lasted into the 19th century, we find that even when the first federal democratic elections were held in unified Germany in the early 1870s, the historical divergence in political cultures created by the Black Death was still visible. In any semblance of a culture of deference to traditional aristocratic elites had long since eroded in those areas. Moreover, the socio-economic conditions in Western and in Southern Germany were characterized by greater equality and higher levels of urbanization, which made it nearly impossible for the landed elites to create the same kind of political apparatus they had assembled elsewhere. To the contrary, in areas where serfdom had persisted for many centuries, the nobility was politically influential, and in part because those areas had never developed robust democratic institutions and were still characterized by high levels of socio-economic inequality. There, the landed elites' unchecked use of coercion, clientelism, and intimidation allowed them to achieve significant electoral victories. And if you would look at the map of Germany of those days, you would find that Western and Southern Germany had been disproportionately gravely hit by the epidemic, while the eastern parts, going into what is nowadays Poland, had suffered much less. And therefore also it is explained that the western parts of Germany were much more democratic already in the 19th century than parts on the east side of the empire. But the story does not end there. Despite intensifying industrialization and major events such as World War I, several centuries of diverging political development could not just be shaken off so quickly. While the strength of the landed elites decreased markedly between the 1870s and the 1930s, the centuries-long inexperience that many parts of Germany had with democratic institutions was still visible in the Weimar Republic's fateful 1930s and 1932 elections. In those elections, the areas that had historically only been lightly hit by the Black Death and where serfdom had endured for many generations had significantly higher vote sharing for Hitler's Nazi party than some of the western parts of Germany. From our perspective, this likely reflects the residues of an anti-democratic political culture. And as we know well, the Nazi Party's electoral success was a starting point of the darkest chapter in German history. As you can see, the developments that took place centuries ago, starting with the Black Death, can still have an influence in our times. The plague, but also our view on church and state, has been shaped and changed over the centuries. What we feel and think today is in many ways not the fruits of our individual way of thinking, but has been brought about by a long process that rooted itself in our common historical conscience. Also, the First Lateran Council in many ways was the result of a long development as well. The Council approved the Concordat of Worms, signed in Worms, Calixtus II and the then Emperor Henry V. The Emperor, after much pressure from the Church, threatening excommunication, finally caved in and signed what later came to be known as the Pactum Calixtinum. The emperor gave up his claim to investiture with ring and crosier and granted this freedom of election to the episcopal sees. And it reminds me again, we have had a number of episcopal ordinations in this country, and so I am the one many times who has this privilege of putting the ring on the finger of the bishop and to give him the crosier. Before the Concordat of Worms, that was a thing that would be done by the emperor, in that way indicating that bishop was under the control of the emperor. But Calixtus II, the Pope, obtained the right to name bishops throughout Germany, but still did not have that power in much of Burgundy, that is in France, and in Italy. Much will be said, I imagine, about this council in the coming days, so I want to refrain from giving too much of a comment on the history and the consequences of that council. I now want to focus merely on the role of the papal envoy, like Cardinal Lambert, who had signed the Concordat of Worms on behalf of Pope Calixtus II. The tradition of sending out papal envoys was already long-standing in the 11th century. In fact, from very early on in church history, popes used to send out envoys to royal courts and important events to represent them. That happened first to the court of Byzantine, the Byzantine emperors in Constantinople and nowadays Istanbul. The Pope would have a Holy Father. In part, the role of the Abrogizarius was to represent the interests of the Roman Church at the imperial court in Constantinople. In view of the great importance attaching to the relations between the popes and the imperial court of Constantinople, especially after the fall of the Western Empire in 476, and during the great dogmatic controversies in the Greek Church, these papal representatives at Constantinople took on gradually the character of a permanent legate and were accounted the most important and responsible among the papal envoys. By the way, most of them, and that is encouragement for any deacons among us, most of these papal envoys were deacons, and they were the most educated and potentially skilled in diplomatic negotiations. The Abrogizarius, the papal envoy, had considerable influence as a conduit for both public and covert communications between the Pope and the Emperor. During the Byzantine papacy, 7 Abrogizarius went on to be elected a pope, so there is still a chance for me to become a pope. According to one commentator, to be sent as an Abrogizarius to Constantinople, 119. 9th century, the first papal envoy can be found at the courts of Charlemagne and the Carolingian descendants after him. These, however, are not deacons anymore, but royal arch-chaplains, called specifically papal envoys. And for a number of centuries, popes would continue to send out their envoys to different places for different occasions. A famous incident, and you scholars in church history, you know very well, a famous incident with a papal legate took place in 1054. Emperor in alliance with the papacy against the Normans in southern Italy. And Leo IX, the Pope, sent a delegation to Constantinople headed by Cardinal Humbert of Silva Candida and including Frederick of Lorraine, the future Pope Stephen IX. But the papal delegation's visit served only to worsen the tension between the two churches, between the church in the west and the church in the east. On July the 16th, 1054, Humbert, the papal envoy, issued a bull of excommunication directed against Cyrillarius and his followers, the then patriarch of the Eastern Church, and placed it on the altar of Hagia Sophia. It is important to note that excommunications were limited to the people involved and were not directed by the one church against the other. But Humbert had acted on his own authority, and in the meantime, Pope Leo IX had already died. In recognition of these facts, You might remember, in 1965, Pope Paul VI and Patriarch Athenagoras revoked the excommunications of 1054 as a first step towards healing the schism between the Church. It was not an act that resolved the schism in itself. The papal envoys in many ways were first and foremost involved with spiritual and theological matters. However, in the 13th and 14th century, with the development of the nation-state, first and foremost France, it became practice to exchange stable envoys between different nations. Hence, also the Pope started to commission his envoys to different countries. Let's keep in mind that in those days, the Holy Father was not only a spiritual leader, but also a worldly leader, having control over more or less 1/5 of Italy, the so-called Papal States. And thus the papal envoy turned into an ambassador like all the others, not only representing issues concerning theology or spirituality, but also defending the interests of the Papal States. It was in the 19th century, during the reunification movement in Italy, that the popes lost their Papal States. In 1870, all these territories had been lost to the troops of Garibaldi in Italy. For the next 59 years, the popes refused to leave the Vatican in order to avoid any appearance of accepting the authority wielded by the Italian government over Rome as a whole. And during this period, popes also refused to appear at St. Peter's Square or at the balcony of St. Peter's Basilica facing it. Popes granted the Urbi and Orbi blessings from a balcony facing a courtyard or from inside the basilica, and papal coronations were instead held at the Sixtine Chapel. It was in 1929 that the Italian fascist leader Benito Mussolini, the head of the Italian government at that time, ended the prisoner in Vatican problem, involving a unified Italy and the Holy See by negotiating the Lateran Treaty signed by the two parties. This treaty recognized the sovereignty of the Holy See over a newly created international territorial entity, a city-state within Rome, limited to a token territory which became the Vatican City, which maybe is 4 or 5.5 square kilometers. However, in all those years that there was no Vatican State, that is for nearly 60 years, the Holy See never stopped sending papal nuncios to the different countries in the world. Thus, while the Vatican as a country, as an independent territory, had ceased to exist, it continued to send out diplomats. And these envoys, most importantly, were also accepted by different courts and governments in Europe and beyond. This goes to explain that the role of the papal envoy had changed again. His role not being anymore the representative of an existing country, the Papal States, but of a spiritual entity, the Holy See, the Catholic Church, which comprises nowadays 1.3 billion Catholics. The existence of the papal envoy, the apostolic nuncio, the one who announces, that's what it implies, the one who announces the will of the Holy Father and of the Church at large, remains important in defending the independence of the Church against any attempts to curtail that freedom. And of course, the diplomacy of the Holy See is different from the art of diplomacy as practiced by other countries. The Holy See is not an economic power, though it sells quite a number of rosaries. It doesn't have an army, but it is very proud of its Swiss Guards. And it doesn't have the funds available for great interventions in the humanitarian field. The Holy See's diplomacy is many times a silent diplomacy, a diplomacy that tries to build on persuasion, on building alliances with like-minded countries, in defending the principal values of the common good of justice and truth. And of course, that kind of diplomacy cannot be trumpeted around. You don't end up in the newspapers, and if you would, it's for all the wrong reasons. There's little you may have to show for in the first place. And while the big powers are able to twist arms of certain smaller countries, that will never be the case with the papal envoy. His diplomacy will take place behind closed doors and needs a lot of patience and building up of relations, sometimes over many months, if not years. On the other hand, there are at times also astonishing achievements. Think of the visit of Pope Francis to South Sudan. It took a long time to make that visit happen. People needed to be convinced, not only in South Sudan, not only in the diplomatic community, but also in the Vatican itself. There was a lot of skepticism surrounding that visit. Would it really be possible? Can it really work? And is it really worthwhile? It was Pope Francis himself who very much pushed for that visit, wanted it to happen, together with the Archbishop of Canterbury and the moderator of the General Assembly of the Church of Scotland. Now, after all has been done and said, we are looking back on a very successful visit that went beyond the expectations of all those involved. A visit that was applauded not only by the government, but also by the opposition, and last but not least by the diplomatic community involved in the peace negotiations in South Sudan. As mentioned before, a papal envoy is accredited to a country to represent the Holy See and in a special way the Holy Father in that country. And the beauty maybe of this work lays in the different countries and people that one is allowed to visit and to live in. Personally, I lived in 8 countries, not including Rome, and I have the occasion to see the Church in all its different aspects. And having gone through so many countries and experience has taught me to perceive the true universality, the Catholicism of the Church. A church which, in its cultural expression, can be very different from place to place. The church I grew up in the Netherlands, is certainly not the church in which I live today here in Nairobi, and it is true for each and every place I've gone through. In that, I'm not only a witness to the different cultural and maybe even theological expressions in the church, but it is also that that particular church has influenced me. It has made me understand that many things in the church are accidental and do not touch the substance of my faith. In traveling and living in so many countries, I came to understand that the God I know can reveal himself in very different shapes and under very different circumstances. And it is my task as a papal envoy, yes, even more as a Christian, to come ever closer to that God who is hidden, so to speak, behind all those cultural and linguistic expressions. A bit like the Eucharist itself, where God hides himself behind the signs of bread and wine. The image of God, the true image of God, is of course revealed in Jesus Christ. Who sees me sees the Father, Jesus said. And that same image is then continued in the universal church as the body of Christ. That church will always be a sign that is spoken against. A presence of God that always will be rejected, especially in our times, I would say. In our times, there's an enormous battle going on between the contemporary culture and the church. Our culture, that is, I speak specifically now of the Western culture, influencing heavily all the other cultures in this world. The Western culture is an individualistic culture based on relativism, rooted in extreme liberalism. In that culture, even the idea of God has become a threat. The mere idea that God exists is a threat to the concept of absolute liberty that our society considers to be the highest good. And coming to think of it, of course it is true. Where God is, an absolute freedom or liberty cannot exist because God claims space in my life. And the modern liberal and individualistic society, therefore, wants God to be limited to the privacy of the home. This society, of course, cannot completely prohibit the idea of God, which would go against its own teaching of freedom of thought, but it wants to limit it as much as possible so as to be of no threat to the desire for absolute freedom. On the other hand, The desire to limit the presence of the idea of God and of His church leads automatically to an ever more present state. In the modern world, the state has become God. In the modern world, it is the state who decides what is good and evil. In the modern state, it is the state that is present everywhere. It watches its citizens on each and every step. In our digitalized society, artificial intelligence analyzes all our movements and comes up with an analysis of who we are through the traces we leave on the internet, through the registrations we do with government offices. In many ways, we have entered into that brave new world where the state, or the ruling power, claims absolute control over each and every citizen. Ironically, the desire for a society in which all citizens claim to be absolutely free seems to lead to a society where true freedom is just an illusion. That is the battlefield of the church, and that is the battle, and that battle is ongoing as we speak. And the church, I have to admit, till now, is ill-prepared for that kind of battle, as it maybe was ill-prepared for the investiture struggle some 900 years ago. Coming to the end of my speech here this morning, I want to come back to the COVID-19. The presentation is warning people that this pandemic has not disappeared yet and has all the potential to come back with a vengeance. And this is maybe also my criticism on the message for the 56th World Day of Peace of Pope Francis with the title, "No One Can Be Saved Alone, Combating COVID-19 Together, Embarking Together on Paths of Peace." Though the title seems to suggest otherwise, the text clearly assumes that the pandemic is over and done with. COVID-19, according to this message, seems to be something of the past. That being said, the message is worthwhile reading in as far as it calls upon humanity to come together in a spirit of true fraternity. As the title says, no one can be saved alone. And the Pope draws up a few valuable conclusions from this crisis. First, we can no longer think in terms of personal or national interests. We need to think in terms of the common good, recognizing that we belong to the greater community of universal human fraternity. Second, the crises we are facing currently are all interconnected politically, economically, sociologically, and we need to confront them holistically in a spirit of responsibility and compassion. Third, COVID-19 taught us the importance of adequate public health facilities. Fourth, we need to enhance peace based on justice, eradicating poverty. Fifth, COVID-19 was at least partly caused because of the lack of respect for creation. Remember how that virus came up on a market in China where people were selling certain animals and how it jumped from an animal to a human being, most probably. We need to have a greater care for our common home. We need to have respect for creation. COVID-19 made many more victims among the poor than among the rich. We need to battle that virus of inequality and ensure food and dignified labor for all. And last but not least, we need to develop suitable policies for welcoming and integrating migrants and those whom our society discards. End of my speech. Not yet the end of COVID-19, as I mentioned. Maybe also too early to draw all kinds of conclusions. Maybe it will be up to historians in 50 years' time from now to look back on this period and to understand really what happened. It's a bit like with a painting. If you get too close to a painting, you only see the dots of paint, and we are still very close to the painting. You need to have a certain distance to see the whole picture clearly. But what we can learn from the pandemic is that we need to be more altruistic, to respect each other, to come up for the poor, basically to live the values of the gospel in a society, the conflict with church and state in a society which in many ways has lost the sensitivity for those kind of values and finds them backward and not fitting in a society which is based on profit and which is basically based on survival of the fittest. Thank you very much.
Your Excellency, thank you for such inspiring opening of our conference. That was a very excellent academic speech, I must say. I was really listening keenly with your analysis of how the plague is a turning point in the history, how it changed our lifestyle, our economy, our labor markets, our institutions, and above all, our culture. And that deep, profound impact continues throughout centuries, even till today. And thank you also for reminding us about changes in the language. That word quarantine, that I still have problems to spell, actually indeed comes from the time of the Black Death. And also thank you for reminding us about our key values for Christians, but also for every human on earth, that despite the plagues, despite the challenges, we need to keep our values of focusing on the poor and being hospitable to the migrants. After all, this is what defines us as human beings. And as a token of appreciation, we have a small gift for you. I will welcome Sister Jacinta, the VC academic, who can give you a small gift for this inspiring presentation. You know, in church history, we are a little bit still in Middle Ages. So we decided to keep our gifts in that style. You know, our office is in the dungeon in Tangaza. We decided to make a special gift that is that brings what is the most precious in Kenya, which is nicely wrapped in the traditional attire. Yes, please, you can open.
I told her I want to check this now.
It is a banana leaf, you know. We are not using plastic, you know, so.
Very environmental conscious. Oh, coffee, very good, very good. I like this. Yes. Very nice. Yeah, very much appreciated.
Thank you very much. We should proceed with our program. I just want to also mention that as we started now conference, we need to acknowledge also our partners. That is Missio Aachen, who is supporting us to have this event happen. That is Harmony Institute, whose director is sitting with us, Mr. Mustafa, who is supporting us also with some side events. And also Capuchin TV, who is covering this event today and tomorrow. One of the key focus of the conference is to bring a student component. As you know, Church History program has a very vibrant Church History club with students who are interested in the history of the Church. And we decided to invite some of them to be part of the conference and to do a presentation. They are at the beginning of the academic journey. They are just starting the interesting research on the church history, so it is an excellent opportunity for them to present the efforts and the studies and the knowledge. And right now we have the first student, Mr. Antonio Cambuta, who is a third-year student at Tangaza University College, and he has interest in canon law and church history, and he's also a chair of the Church History Club. And he's going to tell us about the medical practices during the Black Death pandemic. Antonio, welcome.
Greetings to everyone and all protocols observed. My name is Antonio Chikambi Kambuta, a student of theology. I'm a Capuchin and I'm from Angola. My topic is about medical practices during the Black Death. First of all, we'd like to define how can people get sick? How can someone get a disease? We have some theories. The first theory is that by environmental climate change. So when the environment changes and people try to, or the body try to adapt to the new reality. And the second one is by parasites. So when the parasites enter into contact with other bodies, which they are larger, and can bring some distortion. The third one is by contamination. When someone enters into contact with a person who is sick, can get a disease. Talking about the plague, a plague is very old. It's very old as human being. We can find the first account of the plague in the book of Exodus, chapters 7 and chapter 8. We know very well the 7 plagues. Then also we can find this history or the story of plague in the 1 Samuel chapter 5 verse 7 and following. We remember when the Philistines they have stolen the Ark of the Covenant, how God punished them. In the secular world, we have another account. It happened in the 5th century and it was in Athens. So in the Middle Age, we have two great plagues. First one is called Justinian plague. This Justinian plague happened in the 6th century, probably when the Emperor Justinian wanted to reconquer the lands that were occupied by Germanic princes, and he got sick. Probably this plague, it had its origin from Egypt. And with the death of Justinian, we know that the empire, Byzantine Empire, got weak and was a prey for the attacks, Arab attacks, and consequently the establishment of Islam in the Byzantine Empire. Black Death, people who lived that time, they did not know this denomination about Black Death. This Black Death denomination came much later when they tried to translate, example, the book of Michael de la Pianzo, not a book, as a chronicle. He says that we have in Latin, atras mors, or pest atras. So the word atra can mean terrible, dreadful. And sometimes can say also black, but it's not the correct translation. However, in academic environment, usually this plague is known as the Great Pestilence and also the Great Mortality. If we go to revisit or to see the chronicles of Islam, this plague is described as a universal plague, great destruction, as well the year of annihilation. What is the Black Plague? So the Black Plague is a combination of bubonic, septemic, and pneumonic plague. So there are 3 plagues within these Black Plagues, three diseases, what we call Black Plague. Bubonic, people were affected by bubon in their bodies and swelling. So people died, fever and so on. But the second one, septemic, is a bit different. This was very strong. When someone is affected by this variant, we see that a person cannot resist, die quickly. The pneumonic plague, this was very dangerous because it was, if someone has, could contaminate other persons. The two, they could not be contaminated. And this pest was provoked by Yersinia pestis, which occurred in 1347, some say 48. How this was contaminated, we have different theories. I will start with the religious theories that the God has sent his wrath to the humanity because humanity have sinned. Both Islam and Christianity, they believe on that, but the approach there was very different. Example, for Christians was allowed to move from one town to another town. That's why one of our authors said that the plague was flying in the horse in a high speed because the Christian could go from one town to another town in order to flee from the disease. But Islam or Muslims, they were not allowed. They remained there in the place because if someone dies by the plague, Allah will recompense this person. And the Christian also, they say that this, if someone gets this disease, is a participation in the suffering of Christ. The second one, the second theory, is environmental. Environmental because in Asia, a drought, and the Mongolian tribes with their cattle, they were looking for a place where they can feed their animals. But they said when they come, the animals brought these diseases. And the last one is the most approved that was transmitted by the contact. When the Mongolian trade ships, they came, they brought their products, and these products, within the ship, they had some rats. And the fleas enter in the contact with the rats. Then the rats, they had some substance which contaminated the fleas. When the fleas went back to the rats, and all the rats died, the angry fleas now came to human person, and the persons, they died as a result of this. So Yersinia pestis is a bacteria that can be found in the animals, mammals, but also can be transmitted to the human person. Talking about now for response to the big plague, first of all, we need to know that that time the society was not well prepared to receive this pandemic. As we saw that what happened with the COVID-19, society was not prepared, so was surprised. But medicine was reserved highly in the monastery, and the monks, they translated the books of the great physician in the time, like Hippocrates, Galen, and Dioscorides. So this medicine was also reserved to the monk, and this was learning medicine was a part of education of the monk. Monk could learn, and is a part of Christian charity. In the Islam, also we find some scholars like Razes Avicenna, who translated these books or copied the books of Hippocrates and also Galen and other philosophers, other physicians. So talking about the structure of the medical personnel, we have was divided in 5 categories. The first category we have physician, second we have surgeons, third barber surgeons, apocalyptists, and non-professionals. So the difference between the first two, physicians and surgeons, they had possibility to go to the university and learn how to treat. But surgeon had a contact with the people, while the physician was just giving some rules and some orientation without a contact with the sick person. This structure helped somehow, but in the time of Black Death was proved that was insufficient. What was the task of the medical doctor? So medical doctor was a public figure who could take care for everyone, both poor and rich. these people could be taken care. But they had another task. The task was of writing, take notes, and put in the public chronicles so that people can know, as we mentioned before in the introduction. So the first physician, they knew that they were at risk. That's why they improvised this kind of equipment that we are seeing here, where we see with a very long beak and boots and so and so. So let me explain just the mask. The mask, it has two holes, and there in the shape of the beak, they usually put some flowers with good perfume, and sometimes also they put sponge with vinegar, because at that time they believe that if you have this good perfume, good vinegar, can protect someone from being contaminated. We have a stick. A medical doctor, as I said, could not have a contact, could separate the patient with this stick. He could not touch the patient because it could be contaminated. We have some notable doctors that we shall not mention here, but let us talk now for some medical practices which were common. First was vegetables and herbs. So, the use of plants for human treatment is old as the human being. So they believe that the treatment with the plants was efficacious. The first one they did, we have onions, we have some rose, they could do juice, other could make, could boil the leaves, other can drink, some others they burn so that they can find some smell, and also they can put the ashes in their bodies. The second one was snake. Let us remember in Genesis chapter 3, the snake was considered as the one who brought the sin in the world. According to some religious at the time, they believe that since the snake is the one who brought the sin in the world, this snake must be blamed for the black death. So what they did, they take this snake, they chopped, and the flesh, they put the rub in the body and the part which was afflicted. Also some, they used oil of the snake, but this was developing until some people also, they used frogs, because frogs, they have some substance toxic. So, talking about the snake, up now, snake is highly recommended, but in different way. Maybe if you see a design of snake, it represents a chemistry, where they sell medicine. Then we have in German the group called Brotherhood Flagellants, or Flagellant Brotherhoods. These were the group of Christians who say that since God is punishing his people because of the sin, now we need to make penance. They used to come from one side to another side, from one town to another town. While they are walking, they used to sing and preaching the gospel. When they reach in the town, they lay down and the master start beating them, and also they whip themselves because they have sinned. Then we have bleeding. Bleeding was a practice that since the blood is contaminated, let us remove the blood and the person could recover because this blood was contaminated. But this practice was proved that it was not very good, because imagine someone who is already sick and you remove blood from him. How will he become? Become more weak, and consequently the person dies. We have leeches. Leeches are worms that they are very, very important. Up to now they are being used. They are medicinal. And these leeches, they used to put in the part which is contaminated in order to remove that the poison what is there. Let us talk now about the 4 thieves vinegar. 4 thieves vinegars was a composition of vinegar infused in herbs, spice, garlic, and this was believed more as preventive, as we have the sanitizer. So the name for vinegar, or 4 thieves vinegar, comes that the time some thieves, they used to steal those people who were dead and all those who were contaminated. And they were asked, when they were caught, were asked, how can you steal someone who is sick and you don't get you don't get contaminated? The answer, they said, we show you our secrets. And they present these 4 thieves vinegar. These 4 thieves vinegars we can find it's still there in France. If we go to visit the museum, they're still there. Then we have another important medicine that they use that is a mineral. They believe that taking a spoon of crushed mineral also could prevent someone from the Black Death. Our notions talk about the Pope Clement VI. When he was in Avion, he was not sick, did not get this Black Death, neither bubonic, neither any variant, but he was orienting people to be healed with the fire, because heat, something that is hot, can also prevent someone to get diseases. There are the treatment methods. We have human urine, human feces, treacle, rubbing with the victims with board, with chicken. So someone will remove like that. As conclusion, we can say that the time that when this Black Death was isolating the Europe and other parts, people, they were struggling. And many people died because of this Black Death. But this also is a point where the medicine started to develop. Until today, we have some development. Example, the surgeries start from that time. Thank you.
Wait. Thank you very much. Thank you, Antonio, for this presentation. You must all agree that it's a very good start of his academic career. We only hope it will be in church history, not in canon law. I'm very interested in that practice. I'm so happy I don't have to attend such medical practices that were presented. Imagine you feel sick, you go to a doctor and they tell you, okay, take 5 leeches before the bed and 3 in the morning on empty stomach. That would be difficult. So we also have, as a point of, as to encourage, we also have a small gift to our student, and I will invite Father Dr. Leo Mwenda, who is our DVC for Administration and Finance, to give our student a small gift as appreciation for this presentation. We can give a good clap. Thank you very much for this. I think we are now reaching a moment on our program when we can break for a tea. We are a little bit behind the schedule, but it's still okay. So in the program, we're supposed to have a 30 minutes break. So with 10:20, I request that we get back to the main hall and at 10:50. Okay, so we have a 30 minutes good break. To the first floor, to a lecturer's coffee lounge for some tea and snacks as well. Thank you very much, and we meet here at exactly 10:50. Antonio?
Got his phone. Father, your phone, Joseph? But it's a nice one. You can give to me otherwise. Thank you so much. You're welcome. You're welcome.
No, I have actually 7 children. I have 7.
Introducing myself, I'm Father Josephat Wanyonyi Nabibia, a Consolata missionary, a Kenyan, and the Dean, School of Theology, Tangaza University College, and I'm also a lecturer in Bible.
Thank you. I'm Sister Professor Jacinta M. Adhiambo from the Evangelizing Sisters of Mary here at Tangaza. I am the DVC Academic and Student Life, and I'm happy that this symposium is running today and tomorrow. It's going to give opportunity to our students to sharpen their skills of research and also increase their knowledge in church history. Thank you.
All right, thank you. My name is Father Leo Itabari Mwenda. I'm a Dominican priest, and here in Tangaza, I'm the Deputy Vice Chancellor for Administration and Finance, also standing in for the Vice Chancellor. Thank you for coming. We are happy to host this event, this theological symposium in reflecting on church history, because it's looking back at our history that we know to focus our present and our future. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Silvia Cristofori. I am Associate Professor of History of Christianity at the Link Campus University in Rome. And my research focuses on religion in Africa. And I am very glad to be here. It's my first time, so I am very excited to be here, to be at this conference, and also to speak, but also to listen to the other speakers that are from around the world. So I am very glad. Thank you.
My name is Aloysius Maina. I'm a member of the Church History program here at Tangaza University College, and we are glad to be able to represent the School of Theology in bringing forward this year's symposium entitled The Church and the State in the Post-Pandemic Era. We are looking at two particular instances in church history, the First Lateran Council and the Black Death pandemic. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. So at least hearing from what each one of us has said, so we know, you know who we are, and we thank God for this opportunity, as I've said earlier on. Now, it is good to know why we are here today. In the School of Theology, we normally organize the symposia every year. And in every year, we take note, we have various departments in the School of Theology. We have the Church History Department, we have Bible Department, we have Dogmatic Theology Department, we have Pastoral Theology Department, we have Mission Studies Department, we have Moral Theology, and we have also Liturgy. But apart from that, we also have an institute called the Institute of Philosophy that also prepares the symposia for that. And then the School of Theology also has other institutes. We have the Institute for Interreligious Dialogue and Islamic Studies, and also the Institute for Spirituality and Religious Formation. So you can see we have a big number of students. If we try to put all of them together, there are more than 1,000 students around. And we have students who come from Kenya, but we also have students who come from many other countries of the African continent. And we have also other students that come from Asia, from Latin America, even from Europe, and even from the United States. They are fewer, but they come. Even from Central America, we have those students. And apart from this diversity of students here in Tangaza, that gives us this cultural I can call it richness. I also consider it very rich also to have lecturers from different countries of Africa. And in the School of Theology, we have from different congregations, religious congregations, who are teaching different disciplines in theology and also in philosophy, in the spirituality and religious formation. But we have also in the Institute of Interreligious Dialogue and Religious and Islamic Studies, we do not have only Catholics, we have also Christians of other faiths, but we also have Muslims. Like one of them is one of the editors even in one of the journals of the Muslims here in Kenya. So we see how this diversity gives us also a space even to show that we are really inclusive in our way of living, even in our study, even in our teaching and all that. We see the lecturers from different congregations from different countries of Africa, but we have also from Europe, we also have from Asia and from America. So we are thankful to God for that. And I say, when we are here in Tangaza, we feel as if we have the synthesis of the whole world just with us, and it's really wonderful to live and experience that. And even those prepared here in Tangaza do not only work here as missionaries or as religious or as priests, they go to work also in different countries on different continents, here in Africa, in Asia, as well as in Europe. And apart from the School of Theology, with the institutes that I've mentioned, Tangaza has also other schools. We have the School of Education that has different also disciplines within that, and also different levels of studies from the undergraduate level up to the master's level in the School of Education. And then we have also the School of Arts and Social Sciences that has 4 institutes. It has the Center for Leadership and Management. It has the Institute of Youth Studies. It has the Institute of Social Communication, and it has this Institute of Social Transformation. And in the Institute of Social Transformation, in this School of Arts and Social Sciences, the only one which at the moment in Tangaza gives courses that cover from the undergraduate up to the PhD level. So we have this diversity in Tangaza, and we are really happy that we have this opportunity even to share with you and all of you that are here present to know who we are, what we do, and we also welcome those who are listening or watching us to come and feel this wonderful experience here in Tangaza. And just as I started there, regarding the symposia, we organize them every year and we give different themes. And this one is the first one that the Church History Department is organizing, and we thank them for the great work that they have done. They have worked so well, and you can see the fruits of that and what we are sharing even now. And then in the January, we had also another symposia organized by the Philosophy Institute, which was also international. There were speakers from different parts of the world, and we were very much enriched on that, though the focus was on African philosophy. Was on African philosophy, and particularly the figure of one of the African philosophers, Kwasi Wiredu. And then, so in the subsequent years, we shall also organize other symposia, but with different departments and other themes. So you are welcome, and let this time not be the only one or the first one to come and then go, but let it be the first, and then let there be the second, the third, and etc. Thank you very much for being with us. I have something to share.
One more thing I may want to add is thank you. Thank you for the Wanyonyi for that sharing, for exposition of the structures of our university college. I may want to add that in Tangaza, we are doing our best to be up to speed in terms of modernizing our administration and computerizing our systems. We are one of the universities in Kenya that is highly automated in terms of our administrative systems, our academic systems, our research systems, and all these kind of things. And so our intention is to be on the cutting edge of use of ICT and research in the way we operate and the way we bring out our academic programs. Sister, you want something to add?
Thank you. I also want to emphasize that the academic programs that we offer in Tangaza are very competitive, they are market-oriented, and our students are prepared to go out there and transform the world. Because Tangaza's motto is teaching the mind, touching the hearts, and transforming lives. So as we prepare the students, we ensure that they are equipped with the knowledge, the skills, and they are also given those values that will make them touch their hearts, so that when they go out there, they can transform life through the services that they will be undertaking wherever they'll go to work. We have qualified staff, and we request that those people who have just finished their Form 4 and are interested in joining university to make Tangaza University College as their university of choice. Thank you.
Yes, I just, yeah. Can I speak? Because with this or with? Okay, sorry. This academy is a dynamic one. I think that I learn also through the topic of this conference, because it's so important today understand our world, a pandemic or post-pandemic world, listening to history, human history, and always connecting social crisis with health crisis, that are two aspects that we cannot divide. So I think that the topic chosen for this conference is so important, motivating, intriguing, and demonstrated that this is a very dynamic university and academy. So I am very glad to be here. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Cristofori, and thank you to our DVCs and our Dean. I would perhaps want to just give a general overview of the concept behind the symposium as a representative of the Church History Program. We chose the topic, the Church and the State in the post-pandemic era, because we wanted to reflect on the fact that we are slowly coming out of the worst of the COVID-19 pandemic, and we wanted to put all the struggles we have faced in the past few years in perspective. And one of the best ways to do that is to look back at history, look at similar instances, and not necessarily to make comparisons, but to see what we could learn from the same in the past, see what we can adapt, see what we can, in a sense, transform to be able to fit our present perspective, and generally to look for inspiration. So when looking back at history, by far the most devastating pandemic that the entire world essentially has ever seen is the Black Death pandemic, which officially began in Central Asia in 1323 and would hit Europe and begin to really make its mark in 1347. But precisely because of that date, 1323, and this year being 2023, we wanted to reflect on essentially the 700th anniversary of this Black Death pandemic. And while looking at the pandemic in itself is a very enriching and complex topic, we wanted to take a step further and consider the situation of the relationship between the church and state, because we live in a world right now where there is the conception that anything that has to do with our secular lives must always be put separate from the religious aspect, and we wanted to interrogate that idea further. On both sides, there are pros and cons towards an ideology that church and state should never be separate, or that church and state should always be separate. So reflecting on that, we also realized that this is the 900th anniversary of the First Lateran Council. The First Lateran Council being the first of a set of councils that were very instructive and distinctive for the Middle Ages, the medieval period, beginning from 1123, when the First Lateran Council was held, all the way up to 1215, when the Fourth Lateran Council was held. Essentially what happened with the First Lateran Council is the Pope at the time, Pope Calixtus II, and the current Holy Roman Emperor in Europe, Henry V, were forced by circumstances to sit down at a table together and enter into dialogue to try and find a way where the church and the state will both be able to operate and carry on with their activities without interfering with each other to the extent where they would hurt essentially the society. Because immediately just before the First Lateran Council, what had happened is that the church had been suffering for several years because the emperor and various other kings around Europe would force their own selections regarding bishops and popes. And this was a situation we call the problem of lay investiture, where lay people who are not necessarily within the hierarchy of the church would insist for their own ulterior and personal motives to put certain people in positions of religious power. It wasn't the state alone that was guilty. The church on its own side, there were several occasions where through persuasion and sometimes stronger means would put measures in place to try and select their own choice of king, their own choice of emperor. No, that particular king or emperor was under their control, the church would find it easier to carry this. So essentially there was a power struggle between the two. And out of reason, both Pope Calixtus and Henry IV decided to sit down and try and come up with a sort of treaty, an agreement where they would state exactly what it is that the church is allowed to do in terms of state affairs and what the state is allowed to do in terms of church affairs. And what you call the Concordat of Worms, which Worms being a city in northern Germany, also known as the Pactum Calixtum. Out of this agreement, there was a sort of balance that was held. It was an uneasy balance, but it was the first step towards what we have today, the proper understanding that we have today of that separation of church and state, knowing that they are separate, yes, but keeping in mind that there's supposed to be collaboration between the two. And that agreement led to now the First Lateran Council, where the agreement was officially ratified. That is essentially what we had in mind when we came up with the concept of the symposium. Related to that, because understanding medieval church history, it's always important to look at the art of the time, because human beings always require something visual, something tangible to really bring home a particular message. So that is why we organized the exhibition related to the theme, which you can see around us and behind us, where we selected particular paintings and particular texts that help to bring to light the theme of the symposium and help us understand better the actual lessons in history that we can gain from the First Lateran Council and from the Black Death pandemic. At this point, if there are any questions, could attempt to answer some of them, and then we can return the mic to our capable dean. Yes, thank you.
My name is Faiz with KBC. I was asking, perhaps now, given the history of the Black Death and the pandemic that we just come out of, perhaps now going forward, what can the church do in its own capacity to try and preach the message of how not only just Christians but everyone can just go over the pandemics, like how do we deal with them, how do we deal with the issues that come out of them, the mental state of people and all that.
Thank you for that question. I would say maybe we could look at it from two perspectives. On one side, there are lessons we can gain from how the church went about the Black Death pandemic from a medical point of view. One of the major interventions that was attempted during that time to try and stem the tide of death. There was no real cure, as we know right now. At the time, unfortunately, the doctors in the Middle Ages do not have a proper understanding of bacteria, which we now know, which caused the Black Death. So they had to come up with their own ways to try and solve the problem. One particular intervention, as I've mentioned, was the introduction of the quarantine. Throughout human history, there has always been the idea that, yes, once someone has fallen sick, and you know if they are around other people, it's likely that those around them will also get sick. But the proper enforcement of a quarantine, particularly by the state, only began during the Black Death pandemic, where we have countries such as Poland, which is uniquely one of the only European countries that ended up not suffering great losses due to the Black Death, precisely because the king at the time, Casimir the Great, enforced a statewide or nationwide boundary quarantine, where anyone within the country was not allowed to step outside the boundaries, and anyone attempting to come in was unfortunately left out. But in his mind, he wanted to protect his people. And because of those strict measures, Poland ended up surviving a great deal of the pandemic. So in one sense, when you look at today's world, of course, over the past 2 years, we've had various arguments speaking both about the pros and the cons of the various quarantine and lockdown measures that have been executed by various countries all over the world. But speaking from a strictly medical point of view and looking at how such measures help the Black, while there will always be some unfortunate compromises you might have to make, for the greater good, the lockdowns and the quarantines do actually help. On the second point, relating how people within the post-pandemic world can learn to interact, one unfortunate instance the church regrets from the Black Death pandemic is precisely because the doctors did not understand what caused the pandemic. The lay person in the ground, on the streets, needed to find someone to blame because they couldn't. Family, their friends were all dying in such unfortunate and gruesome ways. And one of the things that happened is that people began to look at strangers who arrived in their town, strangers who arrived in their city. They would point a finger at them and said, this person has brought the plague to us. And unfortunately, there were instances of violence towards not only strangers, but, and this is where it becomes really regretful for the church, there was a great anti-Semitic sentiment because many of the Christians would look at Jews and accuse them, of course, falsely, for instance, of poisoning the wells. There would be a common well around a town and a city, and once the plague would begin to develop around the town, so the assumption was we're all drinking the same water, the stranger or the Jew came in and poisoned the well, and that is why we are sick. So some of those instances, when we look at it today, we could easily make the comparison of what has happened globally when we look at some of the anti-Asian sentiment that has also aroused, which is, of course, a disappointment of human nature, because without looking at the situation, you immediately point a finger at someone because you want to blame. So we can begin to learn and treat people with more dignity in that one sense. I think would be a very important lesson we could learn from the pandemic. Thank you. Any other questions? Yes. Yeah.
What are some of the measures the church is taking to keep the church history, especially
it's a very good question. You could consider the attempts the wider church is making and the attempts the local church is making, and also from a university point of view. I would say from the wider sense of the church, looking at I know over the last essentially 20 to 30 years, there's been a lot of emphasis on going back to the fathers being the early Christian writers and those we speak of as the fathers of the church who lived within the first 300 years, going back to the original texts, reading them in their Greek and in their Latin, and trying and taking those lessons and bringing them down to the common parish to try and remind people about the richness and the wealth of our history. Because when we speak about the Catholic Church, we're speaking of over 2,000 years worth of knowledge and effort and so many lessons that can be learned. At least personally speaking as a student, even before I came to Tangaza, I would always hear mention of, have you heard about St. Augustine? Have you heard about what, for example, St. Caesarius of Arles did? Because for theology, in fact, since even before the Black Death pandemic, the focus had always been on scholasticism, and that essentially is the theologians and philosophers who lived from the 12th to the 14th century, and for good reason, because they were very well trained and very smart, and among them we have, of course, St. Thomas Aquinas, one of the most famous theologians. But when you enter the modern age, sometimes there was a tendency to leave out the fathers of the church. So in that sense, there's a lot that the church is trying to do to bring attention back to them. At the local level, speaking especially here, for example, at Tangaza and so on, our department is quite young, but I know that throughout Africa and especially in Europe, there's a lot of effort to introduce these programs, introduce these departments, looking at church history as a separate discipline from the other theological disciplines, one that focuses on the scientific method behind it, one that emphasizes citation and scholarly research, and like I said, going back to the original text. And those efforts, I speak because I know I'm also a beneficiary of the same program, helps bring back to mind, once again, the authenticity and the richness of church history. And I hope that going forward, we'll have more people, especially here in Kenya, because there's a lack of experts specifically in church history. We hope with this symposium being one step and with all the programs being started, we will have more church historians coming forward, especially African church historians who speak about the African church in ancient Nubia, medieval Nubia, speak about the church in Ethiopia, speak about the ancient church in Egypt, because we need to remember as Africans that as much as there's been a lot we've gained from the missionary perspectives in the last 300 years, the Christian faith has always been in Africa from the very beginning, 2,000 years ago, and it has persisted, especially with those three churches, the Ethiopian, Nubian, and Egyptian churches, and we need to bring attention back to them. Thank you. Yes. Thank you for your time.
Once again, just to say thank you for coming to share with us this moment. And from Tangaza, a big welcome and a big thank you. God bless you all. Thank you.